When I found my elderly mother bleeding on our porch steps, I knew exactly who pushed her. The HOA president smirked from above, threatening fines over rose bushes. She had no idea who she'd messed with, or that military convoys would soon surround her house. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The day began like any other in our quiet suburban neighborhood. My mother, Elaine, was tending to her beloved rose garden that wrapped around our front porch. At 67 she moved slower than before, but gardening kept her active and happy, especially since Dad passed away 2 years ago. I was home on leave from my deployment. After 8 years in Special Forces, I'd seen my share of conflict zones, but nothing prepared me for the war that would erupt on our own doorstep. Mrs. Patricia Winters moved into the house across the street 6 months ago and immediately joined the Homeowners Association board. My mother called her, "that woman," in the most reserved tone she could manage. In just half a year, Mrs. Winters had filed complaints against half the neighborhood for infractions ranging from inappropriate mailbox colors to excessive bird feeder activity. Mom tried to stay out of her way, but that morning, everything changed. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard the sharp, nasal voice piercing through our screen door. "Excuse me. Those roses are 3 inches taller than HOA regulations permit." Through the window, I saw a woman with platinum blonde hair styled into a perfect helmet, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, standing at the bottom of our porch steps with a measuring tape extended toward my mother's prized roses. Mom smiled politely. "Good morning, Patricia. The HOA guidelines actually allow for ornamental flowers up to 30 inches, and these are." "I'm the HOA vice president now and I know the rules," Mrs. Winters interrupted, marching up our steps uninvited. "These are clearly in violation and I'll be issuing a fine." Mom stood her ground gently. "Patricia, I've lived here for 30 years. I helped write those guidelines. If you check Section 4B, I don't need to check anything." Mrs. Winters was now red-faced, pointing her manicured finger in my mother's face. "Your husband isn't here to protect you anymore, and it's about time someone brought this property up to standards." I was already moving toward the door when I heard my mother gasp. The mention of Dad hit her hard. "That was uncalled for," Mom said softly. "Please leave my property now." What happened next occurred in slow motion. Mrs. Winters, in her designer outfit and high heels, stepped forward and shoved my 67-year-old mother. "Art." Mom stumbled backward, lost her footing on the top step, and fell down the entire flight of porch stairs, landing with a sickening thud on the concrete walkway below. The coffee mug in my hand shattered on the floor as I bolted outside. Mom wasn't moving. "What have you done?" I shouted, rushing to my mother's side. She was conscious but dazed, a trickle of blood running from her temple. Mrs. Winters stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her hand over her mouth in shock at her own actions. "It was an accident," she stammered. "She was in my personal space." I ignored her, focusing on my mother who was now trying to sit up. "Don't move, Mom. You might have broken something." "I'm calling an ambulance," Mrs. Winters said, suddenly realizing the severity of what she'd done. "Don't bother," I growled. "I've got this covered." I gently picked up my mother and carried her into the house, laying her on the couch while I grabbed our first aid kit. 8 years of combat medical training kicked in as I checked her vitals and assessed her injuries. Mrs. Winters hovered in the doorway. "Is she okay?" "It was just a little push." She shouldn't have been so stubborn about those roses. The cold fury that washed over me then was something I hadn't felt since my last combat mission. I stood up slowly and turned to face her. "You just assaulted a senior citizen. My mother. On our property. Leave now or I promise you'll regret it." She huffed. "Are you threatening me? Do you know who my husband is?" "He's." "I don't care if he's the president himself. Get off my property before I call the police." Mrs. Winters straightened her jacket. "Fine. But this isn't over. Those roses are coming down, and you'll both be hearing from my lawyer." She turned on her heel and marched back to her house. After ensuring Mom had no serious injuries beyond some cuts and bruises, I helped her to bed with an ice pack and some pain relievers. Then I made a phone call. "Jackson? It's Mike. Remember that favor you owe me from Kandahar? I'm calling it in." 3 minutes later, the ground began to rumble. Mrs. Winters stepped out onto her front porch just as the first military Humvee turned into our street. It was followed by 4 more along with 3 transport trucks. The convoy stopped directly in front of her house, blocking her driveway completely. My former commanding officer, Colonel Jackson, stepped out of the lead vehicle in full uniform. 20 soldiers in combat gear poured out of the other vehicles and began unloading equipment. Mrs. Winters stood slack-jawed as they set up a temporary command post on the street. I walked over to greet the colonel, making sure Mrs. Winters could hear every word. "Thanks for coming so quickly, sir. Anything for you, Sergeant Miller. Not every day someone saves your entire unit." He looked around at the pristine neighborhood. "So this is where you're from. Nice place." He gestured to the soldiers setting up equipment. "We should be done with the tactical exercises in about 3 days. 3 days. Mrs. Winters squeaked, finally finding her voice. "You can't do military exercises in a residential neighborhood." Colonel Jackson turned to her with a practiced blank expression. "Ma'am, this is a matter of national security. We have proper clearance." He pulled out an official-looking document. "Joint training exercise with local emergency services. It's all approved." But my driveway," she sputtered. "Temporary inconvenience for ongoing security, ma'am. I'm sure a patriotic citizen like yourself understands." As Mrs. Winters continued to protest, other neighbors began coming outside to see the commotion. Colonel Jackson addressed them all. "Citizens will be conducting non-invasive tactical exercises over the next 72 hours. There may be some noise and traffic disruption. As a gesture of goodwill, we'll be offering free property assessments for landscape stability and structural integrity." He turned specifically to Mrs. Winters. "We'll start with your property, ma'am, since you seem most concerned. Our engineers will need to check your foundations, roofing, and landscaping to ensure everything meets military-grade safety standards." The blood drained from Mrs. Winters' face. "My landscaping? Especially those new marble statues you installed last week without proper permits," I added casually. "Colonel, those might need special attention." By now, several neighbors had gathered, watching with undisguised glee as Mrs. Winters' reign of HOA terror faced an unexpected challenger. Mrs. Cooper from next door approached me. "Mike, is this because of what happened to Elaine? Word traveled fast in our neighborhood." I nodded. "Mom took a bad fall earlier. Mrs. Winters was involved." The ripple of disapproval through the crowd was palpable. Mrs. Winters suddenly found herself surrounded by cold stares from neighbors she terrorized for months. "It was an accident," she insisted weakly. Old Mr. Jenkins, whose classic car restoration hobby had been Mrs. Winters' first target, stepped forward. "Like it was an accident, when you called the tow truck for my project car? The one I was restoring with my grandson?" Mrs. Cooper added, "Or when you accidentally reported my daughter's graduation party as a disturbance, and the police came to shut it down?" One by one, neighbors stepped forward with their own stories. Mrs. Winters shrank back toward her house as the collective grievances mounted. Meanwhile, soldiers were setting up spotlights and equipment around her property. 2 men with clipboards were measuring her decorative fountain, shaking their heads disapprovingly. "This water feature appears to be drawing excessive electricity and could pose a community hazard," one called out loudly. By evening, Mrs. Winters' perfect lawn was covered with equipment, marking flags, and bustling personnel. The convoy vehicles remained parked, blocking her driveway completely. Every few minutes, someone would approach her with a clipboard and explain another potential violation they'd discovered. Around sunset, a black SUV pulled into the neighborhood, and a distinguished man in an expensive suit stepped out, looking furious. Mrs. Winters ran to him, gesturing wildly at the military presence. "That must be the famous husband," Colonel Jackson muttered to me as we watched from our porch. Mr. Winters marched toward us, his wife trailing behind him. "Who's in charge here? Do you know who I am?" Colonel Jackson stepped forward. "Colonel Robert Jackson, Special Forces." "And you are?" "Richard Winters, Deputy Director at—" With the Department of Transportation," Colonel Jackson interrupted smoothly. "I have your file right here." He flipped through some papers on his clipboard. "Interesting. Very interesting." Mr. Winters faltered. "What file? What are you talking about?" "Sir, perhaps we should discuss this privately," the colonel suggested, guiding him toward the command tent they'd set up. "There are some security matters that require your immediate attention." 20 minutes later, Mr. Winters emerged from the tent looking pale. He hurried back to his wife and spoke to her in hushed, urgent tones. Her face, already stressed, crumpled in disbelief. They both looked over at me, then quickly looked away when they caught me watching. The next morning, Mom was feeling better and sat with me on the porch, watching the military operation with amusement. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, but I could tell she was touched. "Nobody messes with my mother," I replied simply. Around noon, Mrs. Winters approached our house hesitantly, without her usual confidence. She looked like she hadn't slept. "Mrs. Miller," she called from the sidewalk, not daring to come closer. "May I speak with you?" Mom nodded, and Mrs. Winters took a few steps forward. "I want to formally apologize for my behavior yesterday. It was inexcusable, and I am deeply sorry for causing your fall." She glanced nervously at the military personnel documenting every inch of her property. "I've submitted my resignation from the HOA board effective immediately." Mom, always more gracious than me, nodded. "Apology accepted, Patricia." Mrs. Winters then turned to me, swallowing hard. "I understand your connection to the military now. My husband and I have decided it would be best if we relocated. We'll be putting our house on the market next week." I maintained a neutral expression. "That sounds like a personal decision." "Yes, well?" She glanced back at her house, where soldiers were now using ground-penetrating radar on her backyard. "Some opportunities have come up suddenly that we can't refuse." After she left, Mom turned to me with a knowing look. "What did your colonel friend say to her husband?" I shrugged innocently. "No idea. But Colonel Jackson has connections everywhere, and he's very thorough when researching potential security risks." By the third day, moving trucks appeared at the Winters residence. The military convoy departed that same afternoon, their exercise complete. Colonel Jackson saluted me before leaving. "Consider the debt paid, Sergeant. Your mother reminds me of my own." He glanced at the Winters house. "Some people need to learn there are consequences for their actions." A week later, life in our neighborhood had returned to normal. Better than normal, actually. The HOA board, free from Mrs. Winters' influence, voted to simplify many of the excessive regulations she had pushed through. My mother's roses were officially declared a neighborhood treasure worth preserving. As I prepared to return to my unit, Mom hugged me tightly. "That was quite a show of force for a few roses," she said with a smile. "It wasn't about the roses, Mom. It was about respect." She patted my cheek. "Your father would have been proud." As for the Winters, we heard they moved to a high-rise apartment in the city. No garden, no HOA, and definitely no roses.